U.S. President Donald Trump landed on Tuesday in the Republic of Korea on the second leg of his first official Asian tour. This is also the first state visit to the country by an American president in 25 years. What topped his agenda and what's the significance of his trip so far? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. After landing at Osan Air Base outside Seoul, President Trump directly flew by helicopter to Camp Humphreys, the largest U.S. military base in the country, where he met U.S. and South Korean troops. He then held talks with his South Korean counterpart Moon Jae-in in the Blue House. Now, this was the third time the two leaders met since President Trump took office. During a joint press conference on Tuesday afternoon, Trump talked about strengthening Washington's alliance with Seoul and called on all responsible nations to act on the DPRK nuclear issue. For more on this topic, I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by Scott Snyder, a senior fellow in Korea Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and also the author of South Korea at the Crossroads, Alliance and Autonomy in an Era of Rival Powers. I'm also joined here in the Beijing studio by Chen Xiaohe, Associate Professor at the School of International Studies at Renmin University. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Chen, let me come to you first. How do you compare President Trump's attitude toward the two different leaders, Moon Jae-in versus Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe?
You see, it's such a kind of a personal relations to a large extent were determined by United States relationship with the two allies. You see, Japan has been and still is one of the most ally to the United States, and South Korea is an important ally. So there's a differences between the two countries in United States, harp and spoke alliance system. So the relationship between Trump and Abe is a little bit closer than Mr. Trump's relationship with Mr. Moon.
Well, in Japan, now, President Trump called Tokyo a crucial ally, and in Seoul, he said the same thing and cleared doubts about U.S. bypassing the country in any decision-making concerning the DPRK. Mr. Snyder, how do you look at the difference between these two alliances in Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, I think it's true that Prime Minister Abe, first of all, was the first foreign leader to visit President Trump following his election, and also came to the White House very early following his inauguration as president. During that same time, South Korea was undergoing a lot of political turmoil as a result of the corruption scandal and impeachment of the previous president, Park Geun-hye. So I think that the South Korean President Moon is still trying to catch up in terms of developing a strong relationship with President Trump. And also I think that it's probably the case still that Japan just has a greater strategic weight than South Korea from an American perspective in terms of the role and place and scope of alliance cooperation. I do think that the alliance relationship between the United States and South Korea has made a lot of progress in recent years, but the Trump-Abe relationship right now is very close and is probably much closer than the Trump-Moon relationship.
But where does President Moon Jae-in want U.S.-South Korean relations to stand? I mean, from the domestic protests that have been taking place in Seoul before and during President Trump's visit, we can see that President Moon Jae-in faces a lot of restraints at home. Professor Chen, what's your take?
You see, South Korean society is and has been always divided according to the political orientations. And one group could be called progressive political forces, and basically the President Moon's. Another group could be labeled as conservatives, and mainly maintains a good relationship with the United States. Certainly, there's a large number of the South Koreans sitting between the two groups, and no matter what happened in South Koreans and who will come to visit the South Koreans, and the South Korean peoples are always divided.
Now, according to the news agency Yonhap, the presidents of South Korea and the United States agreed Tuesday to completely remove the limit on the payload of South Korean ballistic missiles, and they discussed Seoul's introduction of nuclear-powered submarines and other advanced weapons, according to officials in Seoul. Mr. Snyder, what does this agreement mean for the military alliance between the two and other countries in the region?
Well, I think it does mean that South Korea is trying to develop greater capacity in order to respond to the North Korean threat. Thus far, South Korea's push for greater capability is really pushing on an open door, I think, with the Trump administration and President Trump himself, since he has called for greater burden sharing with allies and expects allies to carry their own weight. I think it's notable that in the press conference between Trump and Moon, that President Trump went out of his way to insist that South Korea would be buying more military equipment from the United States. So from President Trump's perspective, there's a security utility to South Korea strengthening its capabilities, and it helps to close the economic and trade gap, the trade deficit the U.S. faces with South Korea.
Professor Chung, your take on this question?
You see, South Korea initially was allowed to carry or develop missiles with the payload of 500 kilograms. Recently, South Korea was allowed to increase the payload to 1,000 kilograms. But this time, if the news confirmed, South Korea could develop its missile weapons without any kind of limit of the payload. That will help South Korea to develop missile capacity that could destroy North Korea's bunkers and facilities underground. So that would help South Korea to develop the conventional weapons to a large extent.
Also, according to the same news report, the two leaders also agreed to immediately begin negotiations on South Korea's development and acquisition of the most advanced military surveillance assets. And a Blue House official later also explained that the discussion included Seoul's development or acquisition of nuclear-powered submarine. Mr. Snyder, how significant is this move if confirmed and realized?
Well, the nuclear-powered submarine project is one that has been a part of candidate Moon's package, his election platform prior to coming into office. I'm still a little bit cautious about how that is going to develop, precisely because there are some critics in the United States who believe that South Korea's pursuit of nuclear submarines could run afoul of the U.S.-South Korean Nuclear Cooperation Agreement in some respects. But it does show that South Korea is trying to strengthen itself militarily. It recognizes that it's in an environment that is precarious, indeed dangerous, between larger powers and facing a nuclear North Korea.
President Trump actually talked about supporting Japan and ROK to develop their own nuclear weapons even since the campaign time. So, Professor Chung, is the development of acquisition of nuclear-powered submarine a step further in that line? Do you see it that way?
I don't think so. You see, help South Korea to acquire nuclear-powered submarine is one thing, and if the submarines carries conventional torpedoes and this submarine could be labeled as conventional weapons. If it carries nuclear weapons, it could be perceived as nuclear weapons. But you see, there's a big lines between use conventional weapons like nuclear power submarine and acquire and develop its own nuclear weapons. There's a big gap between them.
Okay. Another issue which is also very important, of course, for China is the installation of the THAAD batteries. Now, we began to see signs of warming relations between China and the ROK days before President Trump's arrival, as Seoul announced its 3 no's policy on the THAAD system, which is it will not deploy any additional THAAD battery, it will not help develop security cooperation with Japan and the U.S. into a trilateral military alliance alliance and it will not join a global U.S. missile defense network. Mr. Snyder, how is that going to frame Seoul's commitment with the United States, or did that affect Seoul's relationship with the U.S.?
That issue has generated a lot of internal debate in South Korea, and also it has raised, I think, some questions among American observers of South Korea here in Washington. The main issue is the question of whether this was a pledge that South Korea made under some kind of pressure from China, or whether it represents a statement by South Korea of the current reality it faces, and also whether it really represents a pledge not to move in that direction in any binding way in the future. And so it shows, I think, that South Korea has a tightrope to walk between China and Japan, and between improving relationships with China and the trilateral security cooperation that has developed among the U.S., Japan, and South Korea.
Professor Chung, your take?
You see, the side issues has been troubled China and the South Korean relations for more than 1 year, and so the South Koreans made three commitments to some extent would help to alleviate China's concerns. But I have to say, such a kind of three no's does not necessarily end the dispute of Assad between China and the South Korea. It's just help to share these issues, let the military to deal with these issues. And but the United States and other countries certainly are not very happy. And according to some of the American scholars, they believe South Koreans made too much concessions, particularly and China's so-called pressures. But I think it's such a kind of three-no commitment to pave the way for China and South Korea to mend the fences and put the bilateral relationship to normal track.
But why did the ROK government decide to take such a move right before U.S. President Donald Trump is about to visit the country? Professor Chung.
I think it's, the timing is very delicate and carefully calculated by the South Korean government. You see, Mr. Trump will visit the South Koreans, and also the APEC summit will take place. South Korea's President Moon and try hard to repair its relationship with China, and also President Moon want to pay the visit before or after the APEC summit. So make such a kind of three no's commitment could help China and South Korea to iron the differences and allow President Moon to visit China.
Let's take a look at some other issue here. And in the joint press conference earlier on Tuesday, President Trump said the DPRK is a worldwide threat that requires worldwide action. Let's take a listen to this.
All nations must implement UN Security Council regulations and cease trade and business entirely with North Korea. It is unacceptable that nations would help to arm and finance this increasingly dangerous regime. As we work together to resolve this problem using all available tools short of military action.
Mr. Snyder, do you think that President Trump is suggesting that China should also cut its trade and business entirely with the DPRK?
I do think that President Trump is going to bring a strong message and demand to President Xi to cut off more and more of its economic relations with North Korea. We already have UN Security Council resolutions and sectoral bans on trade with North Korea that have severely circumscribed China-North Korea trade, certainly North Korea exports to China, if they are fully enforced. And really, I think that what we heard from President Trump is probably the clearest expression from him of the strategy that the U.S. is pursuing with North Korea, which ultimately is a strategy of coercive diplomacy, not military, but rather the search for diplomacy backed by economic pressure and the threat of military force.
Professor Chung, do you think it is realistic and it's going to be productive for China to cut trade and business entirely with the DPRK?
And this is the issue that's supposed to be decided by Chinese government. But I think that Mr. Trump sent this message across the world in an attempt to achieve two purposes. One, you see, is in previous months, and Mr. Trump tweeted a lot of the messages, and such messages pit himself against North Korea's permanent leaders, Kim Jong-un's, and that also helped to project the image that the ongoing dispute surrounding North Korea is about something between United States and North Korea, and Trump want to change such a kind of perceptions. On the other hand, Mr. Trump sent such a kind of messages in an attempt to rally international support to implement sanctions, resolutions of the United Nations Security Council against the DPRKs, and he wants other countries to join the sanctions against North Korea.
Okay, you have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this. Stay with us.
CGTN puts you in the front seat as the leaders of the world's most powerful economies meet. Following President Xi's latest U.S. visit, Donald Trump makes his first presidential trip to China. On the table, business deals, regional security, and how to strengthen global governance. Our team of international reporters and analysts will bring you all sides of the story. Stick with CGTN and see the difference.
Welcome back. We are joined on the line by Donald Kirk, a columnist at Korea Times. Donald, thank you very much for joining us today. How do you look at the significance of President Trump's visit to Seoul so far? What do you think he has achieved and what do you think he has not?
Well, obviously, he deepened ties with South Korea. Certainly, President Moon Jae-in was quite enthusiastic about forging this bond with the U.S. President Moon took the trouble to meet Mr. Trump at the huge new U.S. military complex at Pyongyang, south of Seoul. So, you know, there's no doubt that he deepened the relationship. Mm-hmm. At the same time, President Trump and President Moon are probably not getting any closer on what they really think should be done about North Korea. President Trump talked about making progress and so forth with North Korea, but he also mentioned 3 U.S. aircraft carriers off the coast, a nuclear submarine off the coast. These were words meant to intimidate North Korea. President Moon is totally against the nuclear option or against a preemptive strike. Now, President Trump didn't talk about a nuclear option or a preemptive strike. Clearly, he didn't want to upset President Moon with that kind of language. But it was implicit in what he was saying. So there's a difference in emphasis between the two. Interestingly, however, President Moon is all for fortifying South Korea's defenses, building up South Korea's armed forces. President Trump said that South Korea may be buying billions, he said billions, not millions, billions of dollars of new equipment from the U.S. And President Moon said that the U.S. and South Korea had agreed to do away with restraints on the payload of South Korean missiles. In other words, South Korea can fire large missiles against North Korea if hostilities ever break out. Previously, they were constrained by an agreement with the United States to keep down their size.
Yeah.
So now, one other aspect of this was that President Moon said that the U.S. and South Korea had agreed on rotational deployment of U.S. forces. That's a peculiar word, which really means that U.S. forces can come and go on exercises anytime they want, which is very much not to the liking of North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Well, following up on what you just said, for instance, all these stories, all these news about taking away the limit to the payload of ballistic missiles, or possibility of development or acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines, and this kind of rotational deployment of U.S. troops. How do you think that's going to go down with the DPRK side? Is this going to make the diplomacy easier to bring the DPRK side back to the negotiation table?
Well, that will not go down well. That's my view, and probably the view of quite a few other people. However, President Trump said we're making progress, and President Moon said that pressure and sanctions, he indicated pressure and sanctions should ultimately bring North Korea into negotiations. Now, that's not a certainty as far as most people are concerned. There's been a lot of pressure and a lot of sanctions over the years on North Korea. Yeah. I'm not saying they haven't had some impact, but whether they're going to really change North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's mind is something else. I frankly don't think they will, but
another thing,
others may not agree.
Sure. Another thing that's interesting is the billions of dollars of military equipment that you just mentioned that President Trump wants South Korea to buy. Has President Moon Jae-in agreed or indicated the willingness for South Korea to make that a kind of a purchase? And if indeed they do you see the danger of a regional arms race in the region? Because President Trump also offered that to Japan.
Yes, well, in the first place, I don't think President Trump would have said that about billions of dollars of equipment if President Moon had not indicated that South Korea might want to buy a lot more U.S., equipment.
Well, we cannot be sure of that, maybe.
But in answer to your next question,
yeah.
I think there's every possibility of a regional arms race. Sure, I think there already is a regional arms race.
Okay, many thanks to Donald Kirk, a columnist with Korea Times, joining us from the ROK. And let me get back to our two guests here on the line. They are from Washington, D.C., Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow in Korea Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Professor Chen Xiaohe from Renmin University. Scott, we should notice that the DPRK has not conducted a missile test for 53 days, we counted, the longest such law in testing this year, and its state media has not commented on President Trump's arrival in the South either. What can explain the relative peace on the peninsula at this moment?
Well, I think the main explanation for the pause in missile tests is that historically it has not been missile testing season in the fall. I think that North Korea, generally speaking, tests based on their own technical requirements and needs, but in the fall, historically, they have been a little bit more quiet with missile tests. I did expect that the North Koreans might shoot off some kind of short-range missile if they happened to hear something they didn't like. President Trump has one more day in Seoul, and we'll have to see whether or not that might happen. But that would just be a symbolic response as a message against some negative signal that they received from the U.S. or South Korea.
Professor Chen, at the meantime, China has all along upheld the aim of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and protecting the international nuclear non-proliferation regime. China also insists that the DPRK nuclear issue should be resolved through dialogue. Now, there are certainly far more things that the U.S. and China can work together on this issue at this moment, as President Trump is expected to arrive in China on his next leg. What do you think should be the future direction of efforts between these two countries?
We are at very critical junctures, and the mutual conflict between the United States and North Korea may take a place, and also the talk for denuclearizations of the Korean Peninsula become increasingly possible. And according to China's traditional positions, the peace talk always good, and for United States, for North Korea, if they want to settle the differences and the need to sit down and need to talk. But how to conduct such a kind of talk? There's a number of the regimes up there, so we can grab one of them. Six-party talk is okay, and five parties is another alternative. And no matter what kind of the mechanism we can choose, we need some kind of a sense up there. And also, no matter the wars take place or denuclearizations talk take place, and the bottom line is we cannot move forward without any kind of sense we cannot do. So we have to do some sense.
Mr. Snyder, very quick word on the trade issue here. We don't have much time left, but I think it is very important. Also, President Trump touched upon this issue. He urged the South Korean counterpart to act quickly to renegotiate the trade deal, the bilateral trade deal between the two countries, which he said has been quite unsuccessful and not very good for the United States. What is his strategy here in terms of trade and linking that with the security alliance between the two countries?
Well, I think the Trump administration and President Trump himself has been using a pretty tough approach to trying to balance the merchandise trade deficit, not only with South Korea but with other countries as well. He's essentially threatened to leave the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and continues to suggest that basically the closing of the merchandise trade gap is what he seeks as part of what they call a fair and reciprocal approach to trade relations.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to Scott Snyder, a senior fellow in Korea Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Chen Xiaohe, associate professor at Renmin University. And here is my last point. Upon arrival in Japan and in the ROK, President Trump went first to U.S. military bases to highlight the protection the U.S. is providing to its Asian allies and U.S.'s military presence in the region. By emphasizing the threat of the DPRK nuclear issue, he actually made such a presence appear more urgent and necessary. But it would not come cheap. In line with Trump's America First doctrine, both Japan and ROK are expected to pay more in return, either in the form of direct compensation for military installations, such as the THAAD, or arms purchases, or more favorable bilateral trade terms. The ramification of such an opportunist approach for the region is yet to be seen. That is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. Before I go, here's how you can get your stories, comments and videos aired on our program. We'll be launching a special show on world poverty reduction in mid-November, and we need your input. When you hear the word poverty, what comes to your mind? If you have a question, a comment or a story, send them to me via thepointwithalex@cgtn.com or share it on your Facebook or Twitter account using the hashtag #PovertyAndUs. Remember to tag me at @thepointwithalex. Thank you for watching. You've got the point.